Well, hello there, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Stephanie Domet. I'm the co-executive and co-artistic director, along with Ryan Turner, of the AfterWords Literary Festival. Thank you so much for being with us here this evening for I Will Take the Chance, exploring the life of William Hall, VC. If you don't know AfterWords, it's a celebration of readers, writers, books, and stories, and will mark our 6th annual festival this fall. We do our festival work here in Jibuktuk in beautiful Mi'kma'ki, where we're so fortunate to live. This place is the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, past, present, and future. Over the last few months at the festival, we've been working on a podcast with Shalin Jodri, Trina Roach, Rebecca Thomas, and Sue Goyette called A Modern Mi'kma'ki. And this project has given us a valuable opportunity to really engage with what truth and reconciliation can mean and look like in action for us. It's provided this deep opportunity to reflect on how we're standing on this land and what our role and responsibility is to this place and to everyone and everything we're in relationship with here. And that is everyone and everything. The relationship is implied, it's not optional. So right now we're in the post-production phase with those recorded conversations, and soon we'll be ready to share them with you. And I really can't wait for you to also have the same chance that Sue and I have had to listen to and learn from Shalin and Trina and Rebecca. And part of what's in those conversations is this golden thread of invitation to contemplate how we can become better cousins tomorrow than we are today. One idea we return to again and again in those conversations is a kind of simple way of orienting. Wake up with one question on our minds. Is everyone okay? And then from that question, begin to build our days in service of a future where, when the answer is no, we have some ways and ideas and resources and the will to understand what our neighbors might need and to help them access it. And as I thought about standing here tonight and talking to you about Mi'kma'ki and our hopes for its future, it felt impossible to not also think of places around the world where Indigenous nations are actively under threat: Palestine, Sudan, Congo, Haiti, and to want to mention those people and those places too. And I know right now the answer to is everyone okay is no, not really. And sometimes it feels frivolous to plan a literary festival in the face of all that. How does a little tiny literary festival in Jibuktuk, in Mi'kma'ki, move the needle on a world of suffering and injustice? But what's brought us here together tonight is a shared love of stories, a deep curiosity, a desire to learn and understand. And maybe in your own life, you've already noticed the way stories can change you, change your mind, change your life even. Maybe a short step from there to changing the world, maybe. After all, stories deepen our empathy, expand our creativity. They give us a place to meet each other. They reveal our shared humanity. They dismantle the myth of our separateness. Stories give us a solid footing in what we know and an endless horizon for imagining the future. And it can be so tempting to imagine a future that only gets worse. But what if we imagined one that was infinitely better? We have the raw materials for that right here in this room tonight, our community of good hearts and open minds. So thank you so much for being here with us tonight, with your good heart and your open mind. Speaking of good hearts, I want to be sure to mention the folks who are helping us lift up this event tonight, especially our colleagues at the Black Cultural Center who are hosting our live stream of this event. Hello, everyone watching the live stream, and who have brought and loaned us some material on site here that explores William Hall's story. Thanks especially to Russell and to Riel and Brandy and Merv and everyone at the center. We're so glad to be connected with you. I also want to thank the team at the Department of Culture, Communities, Tourism, and Heritage, especially Megan Hallett and Ray Fernandez, who helped us pull this off, and Nancy, and our partners in this event, the Halifax Central Library, and especially our library hosts tonight, Natalie and Nina. So tonight we're going to explore the life, times, and legacy of William Hall. And when we began to learn about William Hall, we quickly understood that we wanted to have a way to be able to view his story through a multifaceted lens, one that would allow us to understand his life and his contributions in a way that the bare facts on record just don't allow. So let me share some of those bare facts on record with you. William Hall was born in 1827 in Horton's Bluff. His parents were African-American refugees from the War of 1812, and they settled in Nova Scotia after leaving Maryland. William's father, Jacob, worked in shipyards, and for a time, William followed his footsteps. When he was a young man, he built ships. And then shortly after, he joined the crew of a merchant Navy vessel, and by the time he was 18 years old, he'd been to many of the world's busiest ports. Then in 1852, at the age of 25, he enlisted in the Royal Navy at Liverpool, England. And a few years later, in 1857, assigned to the frigate HMS Shannon, William Hall was part of a British naval brigade that fought in the First War of Independence in India, what the British referred to as the Indian Mutiny. The details of the battle are harrowing and horrible. The 60,000 resistors at Lucknow were sheltered by the thick walls of a large mosque. From Canadian Encyclopedia, the Naval Brigade's gun crews tried to blast a breach through the mosque wall. The rebel defenders aimed an intense fire at the gun crews, and eventually only Hall and an officer, Lieutenant Thomas Young, remained standing with one of the guns. Together, the two men sponged, loaded, and fired their 24-pounder, carrying out drills that normally required half a dozen. Before a breach could be made, a few infantry soldiers gained entry to the mosque through a narrow crack in the wall, only to find that the rebels had fled. For their steadfastness and courage while the enemy killed or wounded all those around them, Hall and Young were awarded the Victoria Cross. Hall received the VC on the 28th of October, 1859, aboard HMS Donegal in Queenstown Harbor, Ireland. William Hall continued to serve on a number of ships and retired in 1876, returning then to Nova Scotia, where he lived on his family's farm in Avonport with his sisters, Rachel Robinson and Mary Hall. He died in 1904. He was buried without military honors or much fanfare in a nearby cemetery. And again, from Canadian Encyclopedia, in 1945, his body was disinterred and reburied in a special plot of land adjacent to the Baptist Church in Hantsport. 2 years later, a special cairn was erected there as a permanent memorial. The monument includes an enlarged replica of his VC and a plaque describing his actions. So those are some of the very basic facts of William Hall's life, as far as we know. And we wanted to go more deeply into the substance of his life, the many contexts in which he lived and served, the various forces that might have shaped him and his decisions. So we invited a panel of folks who have backgrounds in academia, documentary filmmaking, history, theater, poetry, post-colonial scholarship, and more to help us bring a fuller, nuanced vision of William Hall and his life into focus. We're going to hear their conversation, and we'll also see a graphic reflection of it on the screen above the stage as artist Bria Miller, who's just tucked over there, captures, reflects, and responds to what she hears. There'll be some time after for your questions as well, so think about that, and we'll bring a microphone around so that you'll be able to ask your question in a robust way. Your cell phone. If you have a cell phone, I always forget to say this, but if you have a cell phone that might ring, and if you're not on call to deliver a baby or save a life, please turn it off just for the duration of this program. So leading this conversation for us tonight is Dr. Asha Jeffers. Dr. Jeffers is a professor of English and Gender and Women's Studies at Dalhousie University. In her teaching, she specializes in post-colonial and diasporic literatures. Her research focuses on literature about the children of immigrants, the second generation, across national and ethnic lines. She's co-editor of The Daughters of Immigrants, a multidisciplinary study, and her scholarly work can be found in a variety of journals and edited collections. Her book, Against: Rebellious Daughters in Black Immigrant U.S. Fiction, is forthcoming in 2025 from Ohio State University Press. She's also a creative writer, and we are very glad to have her here. Please welcome Dr. Asha Jeffers and our panelists.
Hello, everybody. Very delighted to see you and to be here. I'm going to open with some opening remarks of my own, and then we're going to talk to our illustrious panel. So, in 2005, I saw the film Mangal Pandey, The Rising. My initial interest in this Indian historical film may or may not have been based on the handsome lead actor, Amir Khan, but I was also studying post-colonial literature in university, and I was interested in this depiction of the first major rebellion against British rule in India that the film depicts. It was through this film that I first encountered the events which would enter William Hall into the historical record. As a Black woman who grew up in Toronto, as the daughter of Caribbean immigrants, I came to this history only through thinking about it in the context of anti-colonial struggle in the British Empire. I had never heard of William Hall until coming to Nova Scotia, and I had never really thought about the idea of a Black man on the other side of this conflict, even though I was intellectually aware that soldiers from all over the empire served all over the empire. As such, I'm excited to be here today facilitating a discussion amongst folks who know a lot more than I do about Hall and his context. Before I introduce our illustrious panel, I think it is worthwhile to bring another historical figure into our conversation, one who profoundly shaped William Hall's life without either of them knowing it. Mangal Pandey, the subject of the film I've mentioned, is credited with instigating the rebellion against the British East India Company that grew into what is now called the First War of Independence in India, and what the British called the Sepoy Rebellion or the Indian Mutiny. Sepoy being the term they used to describe their Indian soldiers. You see, the British East India Company was a corporation with a very significant amount of territory. At this time, the British colony in India was administered by this corporation, not by the British government. Mangal Pandey was one of these so-called sepoys. The British had introduced a new Enfield rifle, which required the soldiers to bite off the ends of cartridges that had been greased. Word spread amongst Hindu and Muslim soldiers that the grease used was cow or pig fat, which, as you may know, would break significant dietary restrictions for people of each religion. The soldiers were not just mad about this disregard for their religious identities. The matter of the cartridges was just one example of the broader issues with colonial rule. There are various conflicting accounts of what happened, but the general consensus is that Mangal Pandey tried to encourage his fellow soldiers to rebel against their British officers, attacked two such officers, and was arrested. He was hanged for his rebellion, but others soon followed his example, and the revolt only grew from there. I wanted to bring Pandey into this discussion of Hall because I think it would be incredibly interesting to imagine a conversation between these two men. Both soldiers whose lives were inextricably linked to the world-reshaping project of British Empire, who are remembered in their respective homelands as heroes. But that's enough for me for now. I am inordinately pleased to introduce to you our panelists for this evening. I'll introduce all three of them, and then we will kick off our discussion. Sylvia D. Hamilton is an award-winning writer, filmmaker, and artist whose poetry collection, And I Alone Escaped to Tell You, was a finalist for the Nova Scotia Masterworks Award and the Gerald Lampert Memorial Award. Her honors include the Portia White Prize, the 2019 Governor General's History Award for Popular Media, and the 2021 Luminary Award given by the Documentary Organization of Canada. Her films include Portia White, Think on Me, The Little Black Schoolhouse, and Black Mother, Black Daughter, among others. Tender, her newest poetry collection, won the 2023 Maxine Tynes Poetry Award and was a finalist for the League of Canadian Poets Pat Lowther Memorial Award. She is an English professor emeritus at the University of King's College in Halifax. In November 2023, she was appointed to the Order of Nova Scotia. Jacob Samson is an actor, playwright, educator, and arts consultant. Jacob is currently the Associate Artistic Director at 2B Theatre Company and is a graduate of Acadia University Theatre Studies program. He is a descendant of the historical Black Nova Scotian community of Beachville. As a playwright, he has written plays like Umoja Corp, featured in the Obsidian and CBC collaboration 21 Black Futures and Chasing Champions, which premiered at Ships Company Theatre in 2016, a production that won 6 Merit Awards, including Outstanding New Play by a Nova Scotian, Outstanding Performance in a Leading Role, Jacob Samson as Sam Langford, and Best Production. Jacob was the winner of the 2020 Merit Award for Outstanding Performance in a Leading Role for 2B Theatre's production of Shante Grant's The Bridge. He is incredibly passionate about the arts community in Nova Scotia and has served as an ACTRA Maritime Council, as a board member of 2B Theatre and the Bus Stop Theatre, and has also served on advisory committees for Arts Nova Scotia. Ajay Parasram is a transnational, multi-generational product of the British Empire with roots in South Asia, the Southern Caribbean, and in unceded Mi'kmaq, Coast Salish, and Algonquin territories. Ajay is the author of Pluriversal Sovereignty and the State, Imperial Encounters in Sri Lanka, published by Manchester University Press in 2023, and co-author with Alex Snabish of Frequently Asked White Questions, published by Fernwood Publishing in 2022. Welcome. What a true delight to be able to host this exciting panel of speakers about this incredibly interesting topic. So why don't we start by talking about how your particular area of expertise or your particular area of artistry intersects with the figure of William Hall.
Hello, everyone. Hello? Okay, turn it off. I always like to have people respond. So, hello. Thank you. Hello. And I'm glad to be here. It's wonderful to be sitting with such wonderful people, interesting people. We were having a conversation in the back just about who's doing what, and it's really nourishing because I came not completely nourished, and so I've already been nourished by all of you. William Hall, how did I connect, or how do I connect? I've had a long-standing interest in the history, heritage, culture of people of African descent in Nova Scotia, in Canada, in the diaspora. So my interest broadly has been in that, and William Hall being one of those individuals is of interest to me. I also think a lot about the past and what do I know about the past, what can I learn about the past, and importantly, what can the past teach me about how I should be living in this moment. So thinking about William Hall is one of those elements of the past. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to me? How do I learn more about it?
I came to William Hall's story through theater. In 2014, I was one of the 3 artists in residence at the Atlantic Maritime Museum. And our task was to stay for a week in the museum and to write pieces on things that we see or experience or feel in the museum. And I saw this picture of William Hall, who was at that time, I believe, if not the only, one of the only Black figures in that museum. And it struck me. And then I read about his story and found out that he was from the Valley, found out that he lived 20 minutes from where I grew up, so I'm from the Valley. And immediately something sparked in me, and so I wrote a piece about William Hall and about his experiences in Lucknow on the Shannon. And recently, as part of Nova Scotia's Heritage Day, I had the good fortune of collaborating with the Black Cultural Center and Community Cultures, Tourism and Heritage to create a response piece to that earlier piece, because I had a lot of difficulties with what young 24-year-old Jacob Samson thought of that story, or knew of that story, or was able to find out about that story in 2014. And so I'm also a self-professed history nerd. I absorb it as much as I can. I'm always hungry for a deeper understanding of my own history as an African Nova Scotian, but also as a biracial individual who comes also from a colonial background, a settler background. And so I'm just like my, this is my cousin also. I'm just put Beachville. I'll just put that out there now. So, but like my incredible cousin stated, I'm ever interested in getting a deeper sense of why we do what we do, why we continue to do what we do as people. And I think history is the great place to find those stories and then discover those nuances.
Hello? Yeah. So in my case, I didn't know about William Hall. I grew up here. I grew up in Chibuktuk. I grew up in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. I went to Michael Wallace Elementary School. And, it wasn't until I left Nova Scotia when I was 18 years old, and elsewhere in the country, I learned that there was a place called Africville. Elsewhere in the country, I learned about Mi'kmaq people, but I did not learn any of that stuff growing up in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. And when I learned about William Hall, it was actually embarrassingly recently. It was in I guess it would have been 2016, when I was interviewing for my job that I hold now at Dalhousie University. And I was coming to give a guest lecture in Dr. Erin Wunker's class, actually. She's sitting over there, and I'm kind of pointing at her. And I, like a typical PhD student trying to find a job and kind of, teaching 3-4 classes at the same time, I didn't have a chance to do the readings until I was on the plane. And I'm on the plane, and I'm reading the readings, and it's written by a guy that some of you probably know. His name is Dr. Isaac Saney. And he wrote this beautiful article that in part talked about William Hall's life. And it just stuck with me, the synchronicity of this African Nova Scotian man being sent all the way to India to fight against people who looked like me. And it reminded me of an experience I had when I was 5 years old at Michael Wallace Elementary School, which was, I basically, long story short, I got dropped off to school, and within 10 minutes or so, got encircled by a group of older white kids. And then into this circle, they threw an African Nova Scotian kid who was maybe a year or two older than me. And they made us fight each other for no reason whatsoever, or at least none that I could discern as a 5-year-old. And when I thought back at that, I learned about William Hall and the experience, and I thought, this kid that I had to fight in this scenario could have been the descendant of William Hall. And I could have been the descendant of any of those people in India. And here we are, 158 years later, being made to fight for the sport of structural white supremacy, just like our ancestors were. So my entry point, I didn't really know what to say in the guest lecture, so I just told that story about elementary school. And it was, I guess, good enough for them to decide to keep me. So that was my entry point. And Hall has been, he's been a major part of the way that I've been thinking about what it means to be a person of South Asian ancestry living in the historic home of African Nova Scotians and Mi'kmaq, and what it means to kind of think about becoming an immigrant to Mi'kmaqi while also having to be a citizen of Canada, and all the complicated ways that we kind of think through those things. So that's I guess technically I'm a history prof, but that seems like the least important part of my connection there.
Yeah, what an interesting array of entry points. I think then that brings us to the question of what precisely is interesting or compelling or troubling about William Hall and his legacy to you. Now that we know how you got here, what are you thinking now that you're here?
Sure. Yeah, so in 2014, I wrote a piece, and that piece was vastly celebratory. It celebrated the figure that I was told was a hero, and that we honored with a picture and the hanging of his cross in this museum. And it glorified combat and war and all the things that I was told as a young man I should do. And coming back to it now, my understanding of how we deal with history, how we deal with who we deem as heroes, is different. I wrote a story a few years ago that was mentioned about a boxer from here, and I didn't know where to start. And I was given a piece of advice from a professor of mine who said, do not get caught up. The worst thing you can do is get caught up in hero syndrome. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, you have to remember that this person was a person, that this man was a man, and that comes with all of the beautiful things and awful things that come with a full lived life. And that stuck with me. And the more I've been able to, and let me say this out loud now, what I was able to find about William Hall, this is not an excuse by any means, but what I was able to find about William Hall in 2014 still angers me today, because it was almost nothing. It was the same paragraph written over and over and over in 5 or 6 or 7 different spots. And recently, having the good fortune to be able to come back to it and be able to have the good fortune of that this is my job now, is to just sit and ruminate about stories like this and dig in. I found his own words, quotes that were written, that were from him. I found that the place where he grew up is still where the lighthouse of Horton Bluff exists today, and I knew none of that back then. And it wasn't mentioned in these paragraphs that were on the Canadian Encyclopedia or on the Encyclopedia of Black Canadian History, and so on and so forth. And so, again, that's not an excuse, but the more I dug in, the more I found the nuance of the story, the more I found out that, yes, he was afforded freedom by the Royal Navy, is one of the stories, is that the reason he was born a free man is because his parents stole away aboard a British naval ship, and that the British captain at that time, when the person who claimed ownership over William's parents came to claim his property, the captain said, I need the manpower, and as long as they were in service of the British Empire, they could not be stolen away. And so that struck me. And what I didn't know, or what I didn't consider at the time, is that he was brought here, born a free man. His parents were free, but in a time that slavery was still alive and rampant in Canada, or in the British colony that was Canada. So he grew up in a time where he was free, but was surrounded by other enslaved people who looked like him. That's nuance. That does something when I think about it, when I think about what that man, the person, would have grown up and seen, and maybe a duty that he would have felt to an entity, the Navy, that gave him his freedom, being surrounded by sailing and ships in the shipping town and building town of Hansport. All of that just further layers this person, not this hero, but this person who did heroic things depending on who you are talking to. And so, as a theater maker, that's where the meat is. That's what I want to show. That's the story I want to tell. I don't want to give a sense of a 2014-year-old, 2014, a 24-year-old Jacob Samson's sense of how we tell a story. I want to tell the story of the person we don't know, that we maybe should know more of, that maybe that I should know more of, considering I grew up, again, 20 minutes down the road. I am a 6'1", large black man. If I grow my beard out every day, it's more and more gray. I'm gonna look more like William Hall in a few years than I like to think. So I should have known more. And so the more I dig in, the more I find figures, and I'm going to just take my notebook for a minute. And I apologize to my South Asian siblings in the audience if I don't do this honor. But Muhamdi Kunan was one of the leaders of the military that William was fighting against. She was a woman. And when we think about how military operations were ran at that time, we don't often give honor and thought to our femme-presenting folk who fought. That's rich. That's richness. So when I think about figures like you were discussing of sitting down and breaking bread and what happens if these two figures spoke, what happens if William Hall speaks to this military leader from the other side who is also a woman from that country? And the more you dig in, the more rich these stories become. So I'm rambling on now, but that nuance is what keeps me hungry for not only William's story, but also Muhamdi's story, because I want to tell that story with consultation and with respect as best as I can.
I want to see you tell that story, my friend. That sounds amazing. Yeah, I find everything interesting about William Hall, and really for all the reasons that Jacob took us through, right? That what you're describing is the real stuff of history, the stuff that matters. It's not the encyclopedia entries that get sanitized to follow the nuance and the complexity. What little I know of the man, William Hall, the man. I share that same frustration of seeing that same paragraph written over and over and over again. And it left me thinking, well, what about this kid who, growing up in that context, traveled to all the different major ports of the British Empire before he even turned 20 years old, in a context of radical unfreedom, right? In Canada and Canadian history, we love to talk about the idea that the railroad came north and that was the pathway to freedom, but we forget that people were moving in both directions, right? Thank you, Jake. Appreciate it. So that we see, I think, of the many interesting things about Hall's life, and maybe I'll leave it at this, is I keep thinking that his life demonstrates the trajectory of what it is like to be not white and part of the British Empire in the 19th and into 20th century. Because, again, thinking about the synergies, if Hall had the chance to talk to many of the people on the opposite side, and I know we'll get to this eventually, but I couldn't help but think many of the people on the opposite side would go on to form the Ghadar Party. Has anybody heard of the Ghadar Party? It was this party of former or disenchanted Indian soldiers who had served the interest of the British Empire, and they believed in the empire. They believed in the principles of equality that the empire espoused. They wanted to be good imperial Indians. Even Gandhi, right? Even Gandhi in the 20th century was a dedicated British imperialist because they believed in these ideas of transnational citizenship that empire was supposed to deliver. But it was the contradiction and the hypocrisies of empire that caught up to people eventually, and it certainly caught up to Hall, as we know, dying penniless and largely forgotten, not being given the honors that he earned, that the empire loves to turn around and point out that he earned. So I keep thinking, when we look at his life, we see tremendous resilience. We see an outstanding, I can't help but wonder when I learn a little bit about him, I bet he was a joyful child in some ways, being raised in the context that he was. I'd love to know the kind of jokes that he might have had with his mother and his father, and the stories that maybe took him back out onto the sea. And then we could probably imagine that kind of crushing realization of the hypocrisy of the British Empire towards the end of his life. And I think that that's something that many of his so-called opponents on the other side experienced as well.
He was a wandering spirit, and that always intrigued me, and especially because when I think of the ocean, when I think of, the naval ships, I can't help but also think of the slavers that were trolling the Atlantic. and him knowing his own heritage, but then to be on those many different ships working as a seaman. So that's always held a great fascination for me. In the latter years of his life, according to Dr. Bijlai Pichai, who in this book, Beneath the Clouds of the Promised Land, he writes about William Hall and the fact that in his last years, he took care of his sisters. He was a farmer, had a farm, raised vegetables, had some animals. But with whatever small pension he had, he took care of his sisters. So that speaks to me of a commitment to family, a really strong commitment to family. Regarding his war exploits, I don't believe I can sit in judgment on him. I think about, it might be troubling for some, but I would think if I'm troubled by it, I would have to think about the context that he lived in and what that context was, and that was the height of the British Empire. And I mean, Britain was like 1500s, began its empire, and the domination of Britain across the world. So he was a man of his time, a person of his time. So I don't believe we can divorce the broader context and look at him as, here's this soldier who's, there going, to help put down a rebellion of other people of color. I mean, that's what happened, but we have to, I think, look at it within that broader context of what was going on in the British Empire and the level of domination and the level of repression that was taking place. So if I'm to judge him, which I don't believe I have the right to by today's standards, I have to also take into account that broader historical context. Because Canada, of course, and Nova Scotia were part of the British Empire. So people in the British Empire did what the king and the queen said they should do. So so for me, that's the complexity of it. That is that element of coloniality that we're still dealing with.
Can I speak to
sure.
something you just mentioned? It's interesting when you find quotes from William Hall. There's one article in particular that upon a parade to celebrate the return to the colony of the prince, there was a military march, and at the back of this military march, there was this old black man wearing the highest accolade from the empire in his one suit. And so the prince had a conversation with William Hall, and upon that, an article was written. Canada was in the throes of, I think, the Second Boer War. And so again, it's fighting for king and empire, and so they want to get some of that militaristic propaganda out that we see in times of war from many nations, all nations. And so this reporter found William Hall and asked him about his life, and William Hall told him stories of traveling to Singapore and told him stories of traveling to the United States and serving in the American Navy, which he did for a time, and traveling all over the world. And it's not till the end of the article where the reporter kind of annoyingly asks, yeah, but I want you to tell me about the cross. And he says that he had sat with William for 3 hours, and he had not once mentioned the Victoria Cross. I don't know what that means, but to me it speaks volumes. And then when he was asked to show the cross, he went to a dusty box on his mantle, and he took it out, and he threw it on the table, and it's lost its ribbon. Somebody had come stolen the ribbon, a relic hunter, he said, stole the ribbon, and he just threw this thing on the table and said, yeah, there it is. And he kind of got annoyed about having to tell that part of the story. So I can't, what I do is I think about and dramatize what that moment might be and why he held off on that story when this reporter wanted to ask about the hero, William Hall, but he told him about a farm, and he told him about traveling and seeing the things that you see that one sometimes joins the Navy for. I have a lot of family that joined the military, and often they didn't join the military hoping to go fight someone. They joined the military for opportunity, for work, for a steady job, for 3 square meals and a cot. And sometimes that leads you down a road you had not considered even, especially as a young man. So again, I think about that moment, and I think about that he did not mention the thing that we herald him for today, and that speaks volumes, and that's his words and not mine. So I try to think about, and if I was to write a monologue from William, I might think about what he might say about war and about actually being in that, being in combat against multitudes of people, and that effect that it both has on those people, but then on himself. And that is some of what we wrote about in this most recent piece. But I just want to mention that his words are out there, and only under repeated questioning did he mention this moment we're discussing today. So.
That is incredibly fascinating, and really leads me to the next question that I wanted to ask you guys about, which is, why does the fact that William Hall was Nova Scotian matter? I mean, we've kind of already been circling this idea in certain ways, but if we could kind of dig a little bit more into this.
Yeah, sure, I can kick us off. I mean, I think we think from the vantage point of Nova Scotia, and we forget how significant Nova Scotia has been to the history of empire, right? Nova Scotia was a major hub. There would be no British Navy were it not for the trees here in Mi'kma'ki. And I oftentimes wonder, what did this place look like before, you know, all of the trees fell to the kind of hubris of the British Navy? It would have looked so much different. You know, somebody was telling me the other day about like one of the last remaining 500-year-old trees here in the province, and I was thinking, you know, I spend a lot of time in the West Coast too, and there are massive, massive trees there, and I just can't help but wonder what some of those massive trees might look like in the context of here in Nova Scotia. So the physical geography actually reflects the legacy and the scars of empire. But of course, it's also like the triangular trade, the movement of people from servitude to you know, into Nova Scotia, the trading of goods. Like there's almost no. It's you know, when we think about ourselves here in Halifax, it's hard to imagine that in the 18th century into the 19th century, this was one of the most important, the largest military fort in the British Empire. People don't know, like, they didn't know that eventually they wouldn't actually end up using that fort, right? They weren't thinking about the fact that actually even, you know, black labor helped in a very significant ways to establish that fortification. So seeing the world from the vantage point of places that are now considered its periphery allows you to have a much clearer understanding of the world itself. So I think the significance of understanding Hall as this person who went to Singapore and everywhere else, like Jacob was laying this out, the kind of traveler is such a powerful way of thinking about the lived experience of that empire and what it looked like from the vantage point of a human being who maybe wasn't invested in the empire. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, we can't know, right? There are things that we can't know. But from hearing the stories that you're telling here, it doesn't sound like he was invested in the empire. It sounded like he was trying to make a living in a way that he could. But it's significant that it happens in Nova Scotia because a person like William Hall, I don't think could have existed anywhere else except for in Nova Scotia in the time and place that he was. And if that's true, then all of the other contingencies of that history, including the battle at Lucknow, depended on those factors coming together. So it's very significant for us to think about him in terms of local history, but local history is also always global history.
it's important to remember as well, you know, that I think we've mentioned earlier, we're dealing still with the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, when he was born, the Abolition of Slavery Act had not happened. I think it was 1829 he was born, and then it was 1834. So he was born still during that period. His parents had been enslaved. So you know, what job would you get? And I think when we consider those factors, when we consider that, you know, that trade, and you were talking about the triangular trade, Nova Scotia was implicated completely in that. And I think when we think about the lives of Black refugees, I call them Black refugee survivors, because the people survived, and they survived in spite of what the government officials wanted to have happen. So they did whatever they could, and when I read about him being a farmer in the later years of his life, I mean, those early days, I mean, the people, you know, spread throughout were trying to make a living, were trying to eke what they could out of the land. So, you know, when I think about Nova Scotia and I think about the arrival of those refugee survivors and his parents being part of that migration, it's important to see how rooted they were here and why they wanted to be here, and that whole sense of freedom. But, you know, but we're still dealing with the fact that, you know, a few years later, the Abolition Act happened. Guess who was compensated? Not the people who had been enslaved for their free labor, but the enslavers. And it was only, the debt was just paid off, what, a few years ago? So I think that those are really fundamental factual elements that we always have to take into consideration when we think about people like William Hull.
I think, you know, much of what's been said has been on my mind and is vehemently true. And when I think about Nova Scotia, I can't help but, or Halifax in particular, I can't help but think about the military context of which we still live. Mm-hmm. If the military up and left Halifax today, economically, we are in deep trouble. Ships built here. What ships are we talking about? We're not talking about cargo ships. The ships that are being built today in Halifax are military ships. The most recognizable symbol of our city is a fort on a hill. And that gets into the psyche of a people. And when you think about, if today you went to the Annapolis Valley and you were to ask, in particular, young men, what are you going to do? What are you going to do when you get out of school? The answer, in my experience, just speaking from my experience, and I'll speak from my experience personally of what I said, I would say what my father did, military or trades. That's what you thought, in particular in rural centers. And so what is the way out of what my father did or some other sort of trade? Some, I'm not saying many go off to university and become lawyers and doctors and educators, but many will give you that answer even today. And so I can't think, when I think about the importance of William Hull being from Nova Scotia, I think about what we can learn about learning the history and learning about how reciprocal, or how secular, how much there is a cycle in how we think, and how that cycle may be older than we think. And so William Hull may have been thinking some of the same thoughts that I thought as a young man when I was asked the question and I said what I would do, what my father did, which is work in justice, or I would go in the military, or I actually said teacher also, which I did become later in life, because that was a job that I knew there was need for in rural communities. It's what I grew up seeing. It's who I held up in my community. And then the other thing I want to say is also, I like to be careful about not putting too much importance on him being from Nova Scotia. I get very nervous about the way in which we love to attach ourselves to human exceptionalism. For whatever reason, I'm exceptional, or my culture is exceptional because of our history, or my culture is exceptional because of our geography, and my culture is exceptional because of the list goes on. And those things are sometimes the reason we find ourselves in conflict with each other. So the reason I think it is important that he's from Nova Scotia is because I'm from Nova Scotia. So that's why I think it's important that he's from Nova Scotia. That's self-serving, that's selfish. I'm from the same place. So I can't wait, and I hope to go live and die in the Annapolis Valley, or beside the cliffs of Balamanon in Mi'kma'ki. That's what I hope for myself. I can't wait, because it does something to you. You attach yourself to it. So it's important to me, but it's also important that the freedom fighters that William was in conflict with are from South Asia. That's important, and that's important to me ever more in my decolonizing my own thought process. So it's a conflicting feeling that, you know, of course I feel it's very important that he's from Nova Scotia, but you know, as we sit in a room full of people, wherever you're from, there's likely a William Hall in your community. And so if we focus too much on William Hall, we're gonna not want to dust off the history books and find those other figures in each geographical place that exists, because I guarantee there is one. So if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, all of you have pointed out very eloquently how the kind of local is both shaped by, but also shapes the global. So in turning more to thinking about that global context, what are the kind of social and political factors that you think most shaped William Hall's life? Like, you've all been kind of making reference to the ways in which the ongoing existence of slavery, the facts of his life as rooted in his parents' migration from the U.S., like how, if we think about his life and indeed his legacy, which is also part of what we're talking about this evening, how might we understand both of those things as connected to these various places that we've been talking about?
Well, I think those are all the factors that helped shape him, I think. You know, I don't think you can sort of pluck him out of time. As I mentioned, I mean, the abolition of slavery was not that long after he was born. And it doesn't mean that the racism, the discrimination, the kind of isolation of people of African descent in the province all of a sudden disappeared when the laws were revised. I mean, we're still living in what Saidiya Hartman talks about as the afterlives of slavery. And so that shaped him. I mean, the British Empire and Nova Scotia and Canada being part of that. All of those are factors that I think had an influence on his choices, how he lived, where he lived. And it seems to me when as I say, read about him farming and supporting his family, clearly to me he made those kinds of choices, right? He made those choices, and I think that that's, you know, very important, because it links the idea of the importance of family and community.
Yeah, just to build on that, I mean, when you think about the historical figures in particular, the most important thing is to always remember not to try to apply the conditions that we expect to be normal today to the past. And in William Hall's life, white supremacy was explicit, it was normal, it was unquestioned, and it was an accepted form, right? So one understood themselves, just like the Indians that he fought against in Lucknow and elsewhere, understood that they were subordinate to white British people. Even if that idea of whiteness was contested, even if it was resisted, as we see the many different ways that it was resisted. But it was a fact. It was a legal fact. It was protected by the law. And, you know, we see similar kinds of structural forms of oppression continuing today, whether it's, you know, the carceral system is one, you know, the fact that even today, thinking about Halifax and military presence and stuff, the fact that, you know, our industry that creates the economy here in Halifax, equipping with the military technology to support the Israeli occupation and destruction of Palestine even right now. This is another kind of normalized, accepted form of structural imperialism that we live with. And in the same way, Hall was living with that crushing realization that, you know, what is one person going to do against that whole force of the whole empire? So I really, like, it resonates with me what Sylvia is saying about, like, none of us are in a position to judge a person who were making those decisions in that time and in that place. But what we can, and I think must learn from the experience, is how we can take that experience and apply it in more contemporary senses, right? And I'm reminded of, you know, like, this is probably during the war in Afghanistan, but the earlier parts of the war in Afghanistan. And I remember reading in a South Asian magazine a letter that was written by a soldier in the U.S. Army, and he was trying to make a connection between the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and then the battle at Kurukshetra in the Bhagavad Gita. And it was such an alarming, concerning comparison for me. I actually wrote back. I wrote back and published a response to it because, you know, this confused young South Asian ancestry American was throwing his hat in with the forces of structural white supremacy and trying to justify his military occupation by making a connection that made sense to him ethically. And I didn't know about William Hall then, but if I had known about Hall's experiences, it would have made for a much easier way to communicate. Look, we have been caught in this, what's the word I'm looking for, in this knot of empire for a really long time. And the worst crime, I think, is when we internalize it and we normalize it and we think that we can excel in that. It sounds to me from the conversation we're having here that Hall was a smarter man than that. It sounded like Hall knew kind of what he was doing, and he was a conscious actor in that situation in ways that this young South Asian soldier who was trying to justify the invasion of Afghanistan would have benefited from learning from. I'll leave it at that.
When I think about William Stora, I can't help but think about debt of service, and I mentioned it earlier, but when I think about growing up, knowing that your freedom, you're being born free, and hearing whatever stories of the traumas faced by your parents, what that does to your heart, what that does to your psyche, to pay a debt that you may feel is owed, and how that may weigh, and how after serving time in a military order, we see a farmer as a result. We see somebody who, again, nobody knew in town that he had served, or many didn't know that he had served until after the parade, until after this article came out. And he was known as a very gentle man, despite being immensely powerful physically. I mean, when we think about the events of Lucknow that afforded him the cross, 6 to 8 people run one of these cannons, and they did it with 2, and then eventually it was just William. And so the immense physical power that this man had, and then in the later ends of his life, he was known as a gentle soul. That's not to say that he was. That's not to say that he always was. That's to say that after a life lived, that's what he chose, or that's what he tried to live through till the end of his days. And then, I mean, hearing you speak about conflict and how we morally try to justify one versus the other, we're still doing it. Empire is not a new phenomenon. it is a phenomenon that has existed from time immemorial. Goods and land have been fought over, and people have expanded. And within William's lifetime, a war is fought south of the border for the remaining freedom of the other enslaved folk, some of which he is related to in his lifetime. And morally, what do we think about that war? Morally, what have I thought of as a young black man, time after time after time, that if I existed then, do I go and serve? That's a heavy question, and it's terrifying to sit and ruminate about, because 3 kilometers from William Hall, where William Hall grew up, is Ben Jackson Road. And Ben Jackson Road, for all who don't know, Ben Jackson is a military hero of the Civil War that's from the cliffs of Blomden. And they grew up steps away from each other. That road runs through a better part of the valley. And I think about that figure, and I think about how I've moralized that war. And we keep doing it, and it's a dangerous territory to wade into, but it is a question that I've asked myself as a history lover, and my history is inexplicably forever linked to that conflict, to the conflict of 1812, it's all conflict. The 3 major waves that have brought the African diaspora to these shores have come through 3 different conflicts. And it is a complicated thing to grapple with when we choose to fight, when we choose to take the diplomatic road, and why sometimes we see there being no path, or we see that, oh, this could have been dealt with in so many other ways, which of course it can. Of course it can. But again, that human exceptionalism kind of blinds us over and over and over. So that's what I can't help but think of with William, and I think about what he would have thought was the consequence of naivety, maybe. I don't mean that disrespectfully to William. I mean, we're all a little more naive in our past than we would like to think. I know I am. And I know a year from now, I'll think about this conversation and I'll think how naive I was when I said that thing. But I think about William Hall and him maybe serving king and country, maybe not. And then the consequences that he would have had to deal with trying to live his days. How did he sleep? I don't know, but I think about it. I think about, did he sleep? I think about the fact that he never married. I think about the fact that he served his sisters till the day he died. Is that a result of a good man? Do I want to moralize that? Is it a good man? Or is it a man who is just trying to combat the consequences of decisions for whatever reason? And that just makes me want to dig in the story more.
Absolutely. Sylvia, you brought up the historian Saadia Hartman, who I think is an excellent entry point into the next couple of questions, in which I'm going to ask you to do some imagining. You know, we're gathered here by a literary festival. We're gathered here among people with creative minds and deep imaginations. So, and Saadia Hartman is, for those who don't know, a historian whose work is deeply invested in kind of imagining and thinking through those aspects of history that we don't have a lot of access to, who kind of reads through documents to also what they hide. And so, and as you've pointed out, Jacob, the very dearth of available context for William Hall is part of what you experienced and part of what you've been kind of working against ever since. So my first of these kind of imagination questions is, if Hall had the chance to sit down with the men that he fought against in Lucknow and really talk, do you think that they would have been able to relate to each other? what do you think that conversation might have looked like?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, because he was on so many vessels and that was the big part of his life, in addition to it being a job, it gave him a chance to see places. And so I think adventuresome and curiosity. So I would think maybe he would have questions about their lives, questions about their families, questions about how they were living, what they were doing, how they were dealing with the folks from Britain, because in a sense, I mean, both he and they would be dealing with the same white British colonialists. So I would think that he probably would be pretty curious about their lives.
I think, can you repeat the question?
What do you think a conversation between William Hall and the people on the other side would have looked like?
I think what I imagine is it would have looked very similar to the conversations that he would have actually had with, and I believe if my information is incorrect, please correct me, but with the Indians that he fought with in that conflict. I think it would have looked very similar. And what I mean by that is not if we're extracting the conversation of conflict, about the conflict, I think you're going to find commonalities. Every day, we're sitting down, and when given the opportunity to sit down and break bread and actually speak to one another, we find a lot of commonalities. If I can tell a quick story about my time as a teacher. I was a health teacher, and we always do this, health is all-encompassing, and you get 1 hour a week for it. And it's one of the things you're tasked to talk about is racism and discrimination, typically during 1 month of the year. Any guesses? February. And so I would always run this exercise with my students, and I would say, I want you to write down the values of your culture. I want you to write down the history of your culture. I want to write down important foods, important things. And so, almost without fail, hospitality would come up. Well, when someone comes in our house, we want to welcome them, and you never leave hungry, and you never leave cold. Hospitality would come up, and food, the importance of food, and the importance of drink, whether it be tea or alcoholic drinks or coffee, drink, food. And so in food, the same thing would happen every year where 2 students would go, so my family has this food, and it's called blank. And I would go, oh, how's it made? What are the ingredients? And they would give the list of ingredients, and then one student would raise their hand and they go, that's not what it's called. And I go, well, what do you mean? And I'd go, that's not what it's called. It's called this. And it doesn't have this ingredient, it has this ingredient. And I would always then step back for a minute. I would keep it safe, keep it loose, but I would step back and I would let these 2 students go for a minute. And I would have the context of being their educator, knowing their background and knowing where they're from, because we would have a day called Cultural Day every year where everybody would bring their celebration of their cultures. And so I would let this play out, and this argument would build and build and build, and I would say, okay, stop. And I'd pull down a map, and I would go, I want you to point to the map, on the map, where your family's from. And so one, in this case, it was 2 young women. And so they pointed to the map, and I said, hold your finger there. And I said, okay, now, go. And she moved her finger, and the 2 fingers were right there. And I said, okay, girls. I said, what can you grow where you're from? And they said, these things, and these things, these things. And I said, how many people in this room, I mean, I can ask this question here, how many people in this room, in your culture, have some sort of flatbread prevalent in your culture? I'm seeing a lot of hands go up. Some sort of flatbread. Well, why? Because if you don't have the right ingredients, flatbread's easier to make than leavened bread. If you don't have the yeast and you don't have certain ingredients, you make a flatbread. And so it was an interesting lesson in the commonalities and how quickly we can turn those commonalities because of, again, I mentioned it earlier, the idea of human exceptionalism. I'm exceptional. My culture's exceptional for this reason. We're special. We're more special. And I would go, your cultures are neighbors. And if you really dig down and you really want to do some DNA, it might be closer than you think, girls. And they would have a lot of fun with it, and so then almost without fail, they would go, well, I'm gonna bring in my version, you bring in your version, let's swap. So that's what I imagine. I imagine that kind of conversation, if we extract the exceptionalism of culture, or in some cases religion, or in some cases geography, if we remove those factors and we sit down and break bread, almost like clockwork, I'm gonna find out something about the way your family grew up, the things that your parents told you that I go, oh man, my mother used to tell me the same thing. I mean, give me and you 15 minutes and I can almost guarantee, being two Scotian fellas, big, broad, dark-skinned Scotian fellas, we got some things to talk about, and we met today, you know what I mean? So.
I'm pretty sure Asha and I have nearly come to blows over whether it's curry chicken or chicken curry. Thanks for that.
I'm gonna turn my mic off.
You know, okay, so if all had a chance to talk, I love this question because I love, it's one of the reasons I'm maybe a bad historian, because I love these historical what-ifs, right? I think they would have so much to talk about. So much to talk about. And I think that by the end of that conversation, you know, I'm going to put it out there, I think that Hall would have sided with them. I think that the empire itself, because you have to think about the work that had gone in to stimulating the first war of independence in India, right? Generations of struggle, generations of coming up against the hypocrisies of the Company Raj, as they called it. This is before the establishment of the formal British Empire in South Asia. It was run by a corporation that was so corrupt that that the British government, the British colonial government, had to step in because they were so corrupt. And think about how corrupt the British imperial government was, that they had to step in eventually. So the levels of hypocrisy that the Indians, the so-called sepoys, were up against. And you know, just to put it into context, I wrote a couple of stats down here. You know, in the decades leading up to this war, this conflict, there was about 200,000 soldiers in the British Indian Army. But of that 200,000, they were broken into 170 sepoy battalions comprised of so-called natives, you know, like, which were not all Indians. They were people from Malaysia, some people from Africa, some people from Sri Lanka. They just used a generic term that they called native, and native could mean anything that wasn't British, right, in this time period. So native troops, 170 battalions across Bengal, Madras, and Bombay, and there were only 16 battalions of white British people. 16 battalions versus 170 battalions of so-called natives. Hall would have been with his people, you know, his cousins at least, even if they didn't have that same reaction. He would have been very comfortable, I think, with that group of people. And they, you know, as warriors confronting this one giant man operating a gun at the level that he was operating, that it's supposed to take 6 human beings, they would have seen this guy and seen like Hanuman or something. You know what I mean? Like this guy, and I'm not saying that to be pedantic, it's like, they would have been impressed. And I think they would have impressed each other. And if they had the opportunity to really sit and talk over a cup of tea, or what have you, maybe something stronger, they would have found these points of continuity. And I think that's generally one of the reasons, you know, we all hear about the British Empire being really good at divide and conquer, right? They divide and conquer everywhere they go. The reason they divide is because the possibility of racialized people coming together was unthinkable for people where there was, you know, such a tiny, tiny array of elite white people that were trying to fool the rest of us into our own subordinates. And George Orwell wrote about this, right? He wrote that story about How to Shoot an Elephant, where he's stationed in Burma in the 1940s in the war as a young white officer, and he's looking around and he's like, it is absolutely absurd to think that the British are running this place. Like anything could happen here and we'd be powerless to stop it. And I think that was really the motivating factor behind the British Empire's strategy of keeping people away from each other. Whether we're talking about slave plantations in the Caribbean, where they worked to make sure that they got people who didn't speak the same language, or later with the indentureship period, when they tried to make sure that the Africans and the Indians couldn't interact with one another in the early periods. The idea of division for fear of what would happen if people came together to talk. So I love this question because like I said earlier, many of the Indians who would lose this war would later go on to fight in the Ghadar movement that I mentioned earlier, but also they would go on, their descendants would go on to form the Indian National Army, which would mutiny again against the British and side with the Japanese in the 1940s, because why on earth would subject people serve the British Empire? You remember that the leader of the British Empire during the war is quoted on the record as saying, "I hate Indian people. They're a beastly people with a beastly religion. Their famines are their own fault for breeding like rabbits." That's Winston Churchill, right? We got a statue of this guy right across the street. He's supposed to be a hero. I mean, I'll accept that William Hall can be a hero because there's enough ambiguity there. We're talking about this man as a human being, but I will not accept Churchill as any kind of a hero. So thinking about, the possibilities of people crushed by structural white supremacy across time and across place coming together, it's one of the most exciting things. I wish I had creative ability to do that. Fortunately, my brother does. So I got to hook you up with my brother. You two will have wonderful things to create together.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, and I think you have all really spoken to the fact that as a sailor and as a soldier, fighting against other soldiers who up until the conflict started were basically a part of the same global military that he was technically a part of, there is a lot of continuity there. There is a sense of this hierarchy that they would all be familiar with that you pointed out, Sylvia. So that was a question about kind of thinking, imagining the moment. My next question for you is about imagining yourselves in conversation with William Hall. What kinds of questions would you be interested in asking him? What might you want to say to him?
Well, Mr. Hall, I'd like to know how you were treated by your fellow sailors. I'd like to know how they looked at you. Did they speak kindly, respectfully to you? What was that experience like? I'd also like to know whether your parents told you any stories, and whether you gathered any stories in your many travels. Like, what was that like when you stopped at a port and people came to the ship? Like, did they tell you stories, or did you have stories? What did you and your sisters talk about? So that would be a start.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess if I had the opportunity to talk to Hall, the message that I would want to convey, I would want to hear what he has to say to me first in the way that Sylvia outlined. And if I had to think about what I would try to convey to him and at what point in his life, I wish I could go to right before he deployed, to India. And my only message would be this: at times, treason is the highest form of patriotism. And I feel like it might resonate then and with now, right? Because the idea that you can go and serve, your country or your empire or what have you, and that there's a moral goodness to that anyway, is not necessarily as morally compelling as, like I talked about earlier, about siding with the people who are experiencing the oppression and siding with them instead. And we can learn from that message now as much as we could learn from it then. But the opportunity, right? Like, Hall wouldn't have had the opportunity. They would have worked real hard to make sure that Hall didn't have the opportunity to interact with the so-called mutiny. Like, if you look at the historical record of how the British were historicizing, even in the moment. I've looked at records from 2-3 years out at the inquiries and whatnot, and every possible, they were into witchcraft, they're into superstition, everybody's just really concerned about whether it's beef or pork tallow, all of the different stories and mythologies. The only thing they never did was ask an Indian. You know what I mean? Like, what do you actually think? What are the reasons why you're opposed to it? It's not the decades of oppression. It's because you got a problem with beef. You know what I mean? Like, that's the kind of stuff that gives rise to the ridiculous kind of Hindutva, kind of Hindu fascism that we see in India today. But anyway, yeah, that's what I would love to talk to Hall about. I'd want to know about what do you think about treason in the context of empire?
I have really basic, where'd you go swimming? Because I used to swim here. Did you go swimming there? Was there a beach there? So I have those basic questions as somebody who grew up steps away from where he grew up. Who'd you call uncle? Who'd you call aunt? Because you came up with your parents just came up together with a myriad of other refugees and freedom fighters. How did the community form? I have those questions. Where'd y'all live? Because those homes either aren't there anymore or they don't have that context. But there would have been a black community that would have been built in Mi'kma'ki. Where was it? Was it Hansport? Was it just outside? So I have all those questions. And then in the question of I come back to heroicism. And nobody I know, or very infrequently, when I talk to people who I consider heroes, if you were to ask someone we consider a hero, do you consider yourself a hero? In my experience, the answer is not often no. The question I would want to ask William Hall, after finding his words and being so angry that I hadn't been able to find them as easily, it was not easy. It took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of hard digging to find the article. How do you want to be remembered? What do you want to be remembered by? And what do you want to be remembered as? Do you want to be remembered as a soldier? Do you want to be remembered as a farmer? Do you want to be remembered as a brother? That's how he died. He died a brother of 2 older sisters. That would be the main question. And nobody would want to be, that's a hard question to answer. But confronting your own mortality and going, what story should I write? If I'm going to write your story, how do you want that to be written? Is the main question I can't get out of my head. And who else's story is ingrained in yours? Is there somebody on the other side that's ingrained in your story? Because I can almost guarantee there is. Very, very infrequently do people go in and not know something about who's on the other side. So who did you admire? Because so often when I've never served, I know many who did, when I ask them questions about what they admire about the people they were facing, the list is long, often. The list is not demonizing often. It may have been at one point. It may have been at one point, but so often when you sit two combatants down, 2 former combatants down, years after, when they're old and they're gray and their bodies are way more frail than they were, in my experience, and it's just from YouTube videos and books and quotes, there's a lot of admiration. There's a lot of, sometimes there's not reconciliation, but there is we used to say game respects game, and I don't know what else to say other than a nod of we were both there. We know what it felt like. We know what we saw. So I would ask that question, who on the other side? Is there a name? Is there a name that your story is forever attached to that would have been on the other side?
Thank you so much for indulging me with these more imaginative questions. Again, we've kind of already touched on this a little bit, but I would like us to dig into the question of what precisely is the value of thinking and talking about Hall and his legacy today. I mean, apart from all of us being big old history nerds and finding the past fascinating, what does this conversation speak to in our current moment?
You know, right before I got here, I was reading this article about a biography that was written on Frantz Fanon, and I didn't get to finish the article, but one part of it really stuck out to me, which is that Fanon confided to his mother his regret for fighting for a people, meaning the French, that ultimately humiliated him. And it just really struck a chord about how, you know, everything about Hall's life is full of lessons that we need to take and apply in the present that we live here too. Like, I can't help but wonder that after this illustrious career and all the things that came before it, the fact that the empire, you know, it just reminds me that brown and black people in the context of empire and settler colonization are intended to be fodder. That's what we're intended to be. And when we are more than that, we get treated as exceptions, right? And I'm moved by the fact, you know, what you were saying earlier about how there's a William Hall in every community. And I think that that's the enduring lesson to take away from that, is that the idea, they're not individual acts of heroism, like the everyday acts of resistance to the degrading dehumanization of white supremacy that people have been resisting ever since the first establishment of white supremacy, you know? I think that is something that we see even in, like, as Hall goes to India, even though he's fighting against the Indians, there's something about his legacy and his story and his bravery. You know, like, to me, when I think about, like, why did he fight so bravely? It's probably because he was a captain and he had a measure of moral responsibility to the individual men that he was fighting with. You know what I mean? It was not a big imperial project. I don't think that people would do that for a big imperial project, but I think they would do that for men that they've been serving with for a long time, right? I think that's the military ethic at its finest, if we can call it that. So there's every piece, every step of Hall's life that we know about and that we're going to continue learning about as you do your work, I think bringing some of this to life is full of lessons. And I look forward to continuing to learn from Hall.
Okay. The futility of war and the importance of peace. That his last years were peaceful on a farm with his sisters. That's it. The absolute and utter futility of war and hate. And we have to talk about him. He survived. He was able to survive. And so we learned about him. So it may help us to talk about war and why we have to do individually and collectively every damn thing we can do to prevent that from happening. That's all.
I mean, that's it for me, if I'm honest. My cousin said it beautifully. It's the for what? For what? What are we? Trade's always existed. Trade's not a new thing. You have something I need, I have something you need. We can shake hands and share. And so often, there's a quote, you know, rich men start the wars and poor men go die in them. That's not the actual quote. But that's what sticks out to me about that story. Also, for me personally, it's the carefulness of which those who wish to tell other people's stories, the carefulness of which we are tasked to approach other people's stories, the absolute care that must be taken. Because I can tell, back in the day, in theater, I could write the William Hall story, and that'd be it. And maybe it tours, and maybe it goes up, and maybe it's good. But it's not just William Hall's story. It's never just the figure that you're talking about story. It is the story of that country, or that series of city-states, or that series of wherever he was in the world. It's their story also. And so that's what I have to remember when I look at William Hall's story, because if I dig a little deeper, I bet you I'm going to find a quote that I may not like, unfortunately. And I'm not disparaging the man. I am just speaking as a flawed human sitting here. If we dig deeper, if we keep lauding people, if we keep holding people up, if we keep building statues of humans, we're gonna continue to get in trouble. We're going to continue to get in trouble. I'm not saying we can't write about them, and I'm not saying we can't talk about them. We should, for exactly the reasons that both my peers and now friends have said up here. We have to keep talking about them, but when we build the statue, we have to be very careful to, if we could build a statue, have the placards, have the multiple placards that gives the context, that gives the nuance, the beautiful and tragic nuance that's a play, that's theater. When you watch a movie, you're watching good, you're watching bad, you're watching heartbreak, you're watching despair, you're watching all those things. The nuance is where the story lies, and we are, those of us who feel compelled and tasked to tell stories need to be careful about how we do it, and not to herald, but just to talk about the thing that I think about most about the importance of him being Nova Scotian, the importance of William Hall, is that he came back. He came back. He wanted to live and die in the same place that I would love and have the privilege, if I'm able, to live and die. What is that? Why? That sticks with me, and that I can herald, and that I can hold up, that he felt an attachment to the same place that I felt. The deeds done to the men that were around him, sure, I can admire that. But I just want us to be very, very careful of when we build the statue or when we tell the story. So that's what I think about when I think about William's story. I ramble, my bad. I go on and on. I talk in circles, so let me just say apologies to those online and to those here.
Disagree. You've all spoken incredibly thoughtfully and compellingly. So I disagree with your assessment of yourself.
You're outvoted.
So as my final question for you all before we open up our discussion to questions and comments from the audience is there anything else that you really want to say about William Hall, about his context, about the legacy that we've been discussing, truly about anything that's kind of come up through this discussion that we haven't touched yet?
Tender black men. When I hear about quotes of William Hall, again, before he passed, the community knew him as the kind old man down the street, who again was a big human. And we don't see it enough. And I've experienced it a lot in my life, been very fortunate. So just the image of all the things, and then the culmination of a life of conflict and a life of nuance and a life of combat resulting in, I would like to imagine, as a large, tender black man, which, yeah, I just want to see more of in media.
Okay, thank you all so much. And thank you all for being here and for listening. We have a mic runner who can come to you if you have a question or a comment. We've got some time. You have three glorious humans in front of you, ask them things.
Thank you for the wonderful conversation. Listening, I could not help but think about an article I read online recently about an African Nova Scotian man who wanted to start tours of African Nova Scotian sites, and the powers that be, I don't need to say any more? Oh, man. And the powers that be, meaning the white tour bus operators, apparently can have some sway, and apparently didn't want him to have this company or do these tours because, as one of them said, there's no history or nobody would be interested in African Nova Scotian history. So I would like to hear your response to that. I understand there was going to be a meeting on Monday. I don't know what the outcome of it was, but listening to you and all of the wealth of the history here, that came immediately to mind. So thank you.
Can I go? Because I got stats. My stats may be wrong. I have them written down. If you want them shared, I absolutely can. $109 billion is what was spent in 2019 by black travelers, primarily black American leisure travelers. $109 billion. It is the fastest growing tourism sector in North America in terms of demographics. That's a fact. And it's only ever growing. Cruise ships and where they like to go and spend their money, and there's a few towns, and I think in Alberta and I think in Ontario, that have really keyed in. Where these black people like to go and spend their money is in culturally relevant spaces. They like to go to towns that have historical significance, and then they like to spend their money, not just in black businesses, but all the businesses, but they like to spend their money at the black restaurant or at the pub that's playing the black music. And so it is the fastest growing tourism sector in North America, and we have not figured it out yet. And those statistics are all there, they're all sitting there. And so I'm a biracial human. Listen, I like pipe and fiddle. I'll jam to some bagpipes right now. I'll do it. I promise you, I love it. I genuinely do love it. But also, when are we gonna figure out that the tourism sector could grow a lot more in this city? Why, when we go to pubs, do we not see black musicians playing the music? And Halifax has been known as a music town. Toronto producers their first stop was always Halifax, because the next big thing musically used to come out of this city time after time after time, because you could not throw a stone in any direction in Halifax and not hear live music. And the excuse used to be, well, this is an Irish bar, or this is a Scottish pub. And I go, they're playing the same 80s rock songs in every pub. It's all covers. So what are we talking about? That excuse doesn't hold. And so when I hear that, I read that article, and it enraged me a great deal, because I know the statistics, I know where the money is. I know that the tourism board of this province know where the money is. They know that that is one of the highest growing sectors in tourism. There's lots of black people on these cruise ships that are coming to these towns, and they're not spending as much money as they would if we invested in these culturally relevant spots and in the art and culture of not just the African diaspora, but also our Mi'kmaq siblings, and also our Mi'kmaq siblings, and also the other myriad of cultures that make up Halifax. That's where people want to spend their money. And so, don't get me started, but they're statistically wrong, is what I guess is what I'll say. And if the business fails, it fails. We want to claim that we're a free market society, and I don't get me started on, we can talk about capitalism another time. But if it's, what's the harm? Is there a takeaway? If there's a risk of a takeaway, then that must be the reason they don't want does that make sense? It's competition, it's just competition. So, exactly, statistically, and what I'm saying is there may be enough if we invest properly, and if we build the sites, and if we invest in places like the Black Cultural Center of Nova Scotia, and hold these places, these significant historic places up, and we keep investing, there may be enough for 3 bus tours, is what I'm saying. Because there's enough history, and there's enough spaces, and there's enough people here to go see and to go experience. Sorry, I'm on my soapbox now. That article got me hot, so.
Yeah, I just, okay, a bit of historical context. In the late 1970s, a good friend of mine named Savannah Williams, who was here in Nova Scotia, she's from Virginia, and she started doing tours when the cruise ships came in. She organized, had a small van, and as a Black woman doing tours, that was completely unheard of. She got pushback, but she persisted. So this was in the 1970s when she decided that there should be tours around the province, going to Black historical sites, going to other sites as well. And she got the kind of pushback from other white tour companies, which weren't many at the time. So when she started the work that she was doing, there weren't that many out there on the road doing that. The province also, a number of years ago, with a number of African Nova Scotian organizations, put together this map of Nova Scotia. Probably Russell may be able to speak to this. There's a map that was done of all the Black historic sites in the province. And the idea was that this could be given to tour companies, this could be sent around to encourage more visitation to the Black sites in Nova Scotia, where there are a lot. So, you know, those things have happened, but there is a real sense of ownership on the part of the larger bus companies, because they want to load them onto the buses. You know, if you go to Lunenburg in the fall, you will see it. 15 buses lined up. And I think the fact that these Black entrepreneurs know that they can pick up people to go. I mean, there are Black people on those tour ships, those, what do you call them, not tour ships? Cruise ships, yeah, cruise ships. There are Black people on those cruise ships, and there have been. So I think it really is a question of not wanting the competition, not having any understanding of the history and legacy of Black people in this province. So it's just insulting for those folks, you know, those companies to go and say, there is no business, there is no market, because over time that has been proven to be wrong. So just like Jacob, don't get me started on that. But I do think it's important to know that a Black woman in Nova Scotia back in the 1970s was doing tours around the province.
Yeah, I mean, when I heard that on CBC. I was driving my daughter to school, my 5-year-old daughter, and I got really mad and upset in the car, and I started slamming on the thing. I was like, what do these people know about history? And my daughter kicked in, and she was like, yeah, what do they know about history? And it's just like, you know, the level of history that's here is never going to be captured by these tour buses that come around and take people to see the Winston Churchill statue across the street. You know what I mean? They're just not doing the same thing. And I was struck by just the outrageousness that it's bad enough. It's bad enough that, you know, these Black cultural entrepreneurs have to apply for the right to do this. That's one thing. And then the solution was, well, you can now prepare your appeal. All the labor that goes into this, and the man that they were interviewing was really eloquent, I thought, on the radio when I heard. He was like, why do I have to do all of this? This is energy that I could be putting into actually developing my business if this place actually cared about that. But I think it exposes one of the many hypocrisies of capitalism. I had to go there.
Go there, go.
Is that it has the discourse of laissez-faire. It has this idea that it's all about anybody can enter the market. But when you start looking at what the actual barriers to entry are, how they're racialized, how they are seen as dangerous if they start, you know, chipping in. I mean, heaven forbid that the old triangle has to come to terms with the fact that maybe there's more to this place than Celtic music, you know what I mean? And I also love Celtic music. There's room for bagpipes in the revolution, absolutely. But like, you know, they've been disproportionately centered in the story of so-called New Scotland, right? There's no room for Mi'kma'ki. There's no room for African. I'm going to go back to where I started. I grew up here and I didn't know any of this history. And that's probably because maybe I took the Harbor Hopper or something, but I didn't have a good bus tour to actually tell me about any of this history. So I share your outrage for sure.
Hi, I actually also want to, when Sylvia, you were mentioning that, or both of you were mentioning that there are many Black tourists that would want to see this. But it's also kind of going back to the idea of divide and conquer, because it's not just Black people that want to know the history of the Black people here. It's many of us that would benefit and want to, but like Ajay is saying, if you don't hear it, if there's no one to take the initiative to have that tour, how will we ever know? And how will we ever, Black, yellow, white, whatever bodies, how will we connect? So it is kind of, I think, it is laissez-faire, but it is also divide and conquer. And that's just I was also enraged because that's what it kind of reminded me of, is colonialism at its finest. So, sorry, I don't have a question. Thank you for your talk.
No, speak it, speak it.
Thank you so much for this discussion. It's been really, really wonderful to sit here and receive. I have a question which unfortunately comes down to capitalism. I love the idea of William Hall sitting and speaking to his peers on the other side, if you will, and what they would have spoken about and how they would have seen that they had more in common. And I think about that in the context of today, and they couldn't do that because of the urgencies that they were in and the situations that they were in. And then I think about today and how those similar urgencies still exist, extensions of colonialism, capitalism, and the urgencies of consumerism and all of that. And through those systems as well, the folks who are at the bottom of those systems are very often people of color. And the inability, because of the urgencies of existing, the inability to have those conversations. So I guess my question is, what do we do when the urgency of actually just surviving surpasses the ability to have those conversations and to be able to see where our similarities are and what it is that we're up against?
This sounds so self-important, and it's not how I view what I do, but that's art, that's theater, it's what the purpose is for me, is that those displays of, we may not be able to, take the historical figures out of it, take the context of somebody that I disagree with, and getting in an actual room with that person can feel dangerous. It can feel harmful to me, to them, and so those heightened stakes make it a huge barrier for me to sometimes have those conversations and to sit down and break bread. The magic of theater in a very small context. We are not film. And in our culture, there's a big theater center in Toronto. I mean, there's always theater happening in this city, always. But we have one space, two space that's really viable to do it on a regular basis. It's on a very small scale, but I guess what I'll say is it's someday maybe writing that story and showing a completely fabricated, dramatized conversation between William Hall and this other person, and trying to come up, when I work with your brother, trying to come up with how that conversation might have gone and showing it to as many people as will take it in. And that's we hope to do. And I play pretend for a living. Like that's like, it ain't self-important. It ain't like I don't want to hold it up. The next revolution probably won't be started by theater. Past revolutions were. But the next one is going to be TikTok or Instagrams or something like that. It won't be theater, but in a small context, like what you're witnessing now isn't not theater. It is theater in its oldest sense. It is just storytelling face to face. And so you're seeing it live, and I think for me, it's that. It's all I can really conceptualize myself doing, and it's on a very small scale. There are others who teach in universities and are approaching, hundreds of students and influencing or helping their minds expand and grow. That's hugely impactful, and you never know the impact as a teacher until it's 20 years later and some student comes up to you that you didn't know you had a connection with. They said, your class is the most important thing that happened to me in university. You don't know your impact. So the microcosm of theater that's where I try to jam and show these fictionalized and non-fictionalized conversations.
Thanks for that. It's a challenging question in a really great way. And I feel like, last night I was in the South Shore giving a talk that was like such a boring topic that, it was called Structural White Supremacy and Decolonization and Deterritorialization and all kinds of izations. I couldn't even keep it straight. But I was in the South Shore, and there was like 50 people who turned up to come and listen to me talk about that. And, I looked around, and there were only 2 human beings in that crowd that were from my observable generation. So I'm talking geriatric millennial, right? Like we're still technically a millennial, but we're on like the cut. But there is something about that generation where, we were kind of kids when the internet came around. Cell phones were still big and clunky when we were teenagers, but we had this kind of ideal understanding that technology and self-fulfillment was supposed to be the way that we advance. And it folded so nicely with like the period of capitalism of the 90s into the 2000s, which was, they called it globalization, they called it financial freedom, and everybody could go anywhere, and it was all about you, all about you, all about you. And it struck me that the majority of the people who came out to that talk were folks who would have been, activists in the 60s, 70s, and maybe into the 80s. And then there were like some younger people, like, I don't know what that's Generation Z, and I think about what I'm seeing from across campuses all over the world now, and starting at the heart of empire in the United States, kids taking over their campuses for moral reasons to say no to the kinds of things that our generations, the older generations, are saying this is normal, this is, and they're saying no, it isn't. And I think that the building of the alternatives to capitalist alienation is one of the most like exceptionally inspiring. We need to inspire our way out of this, right? Because I think, Asita, what you're describing there about the grind, about how people of color in particular tend to be the ones who are at the bottom of the grind, and it's true because race and class and gender, they all work together. But then I take comfort from the fact that, like capoeira was an art form and a martial art that was developed and established by enslaved people who tricked their masters into thinking that they were dancing so that they could win their freedom and raid the plantations and go and live for hundreds of years away from that kind of violence. So even under the most extreme forms of oppression, people who are able to come together and build together alternatives to whatever it is people are telling us is the status quo has always been, I think, the great source of revolution. And capitalism, this is a system that I think has been proven to be a failure for at least 50 years, and it's basically been on palliative care. All of the things that we talk about, it's putting capitalism on palliative care because we don't want to imagine a world after capitalism. And when I say we, I mean, of course, the ruling class, right? The rest of us would love to see this world, and we're ready for it, and we imagine it into existence, and then we just need to scale that up.
I guess I'll add one more thing to kind of draw together what both of you have said, which is that empathy across difference is something that we get trained out of, not trained into. The ability for human beings to see someone else and feel for them is intrinsic. And so much of what we've been talking about in terms of the kind of hierarchies, in terms of the divide and conquer, in terms of the kind of structural contexts that we've been talking about in relation to William Hall's life, and more broadly, are those processes that make empathy more difficult. And so part of what you're describing is the fact that, like, even in all of this, that desire for that push towards empathy is there. And I think, you know, to be sort of like leaning into that, embracing that aspect of being a human being is a huge part of how we do the kind of resistance that we've also been talking about. That idea that someone is so intrinsically different from you that their life does not matter in the same way as yours is something that we can resist in all sorts of ways once we recognize the things that are trying to block that recognition.
I do, if I may. Yeah. I didn't realize we were kind of wrapping up there, but at any rate, I want to thank the panelists so much for, you know, helping us explore. And, you know, I didn't know about William Hall, but I got the invitation to come this evening. And I have a literary background myself, so I knew this evening was going to be really riveting. I didn't know quite how it was going to happen, but the discussion has been really wonderful, and thank you so much also for the questions that you came up with to ask the panelists. Anyway, not having known about William Hall, I must have been reading that one paragraph that you read everywhere, just as I was waiting for things to begin. And I was immediately amazed by what an extraordinary person he was, in that, you know, he signed up as a very young man under great odds. And, you know, if you took all kinds of other people that started at the same point as him, he really had this great trajectory. And so to me, I very quickly got this idea of him being so smart and so focused and so strong and so kind of tuned in that, you know, in that one particular moment that he's being glorified for, everything came together in that moment. And he knew that he had to do this. It was the end of the battle. He had to do it. And he just went there and very capably did it all. And I can also understand what would have happened to him when he returned, because having been exposed to a lot of military life myself, I know that when people finish their years of service, they come back, they've sacrificed, they've served, and it's not just the sacrifice of, you know, being part of the military and doing the work, but it's the sacrifice of family time, of maybe even being able to build a relationship that would lead to his being married. So he wasn't married, he didn't have his children, you know. He stayed close to serving his family, but I can understand how he would have thrown his medal on the table, because after what he had done in that huge part of his life, he comes back, nothing has changed. The people around him would have no idea what his life had been like and what he had done and what he was capable of doing. So yeah, thank you so much for a really stimulating evening.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you once again to our incredible panelists, our incredible artists, our incredible interpreters, and our incredible ringleader, Stephanie.
It is me. And thank you, Asha, Sylvia, Jacob, and Ajay. That was incredible. More than we could have hoped for. Imaginative, enlightening, enriching, enraging, all the things I look for in a conversation. Thank you so much for everything that you did to lift that up. And a huge thanks to Bria Miller, who has just been over there being a genius in the corner, creating this incredible capture of the conversation. It's a truly remarkable way to work. Thanks to our technician, Mark Pinio, and Dave, whose last name I never learned, but who's been doing a great job making our live stream possible. Thank you to the Black Cultural Center, especially Russell and Merv, who are here with us tonight, and to the Nova Scotia Department of Culture, Communities, Tourism, and Heritage, and our pals here at Halifax Central Library. And thank you so much, all of you, for being with us here tonight. If you want to keep up to date on the goings-on of the AfterWords Literary Festival, you can sign up for our newsletter just outside the door there. We keep it brief, we keep it rare, and we try to keep it entertaining. That is our promise to you. I'll just let you know about something that we are doing coming up on Saturday, May 25th. We're celebrating our first ever youth mentorship with a free reading at the McPhee Center in Dartmouth, which features our young writing mentees, Kiana Brennan and Atarv Mahajan, along with their mentors, Tom Ryan and Andre Fenton. That's happening from 4 to 6 p.m. It's free, it's open to everyone. We're especially extending the invitation to people who are between the ages of 13 and 18. So spread the word to the young readers and writers in your life. Tell them there will be pizza. This is the secret of the McPhee Center. They add pizza to everything they do. It's brilliant. Thank you so much for coming. Safe home.